Hope you enjoyed today's video, MMA of the Day video playlist. I think that last question was definitely a hoot. It's fun to see the Brazilians having fun with MMA and some of their mainstream media goobers and dorks and reality show jokers getting into the spirit of things and harassing our MMA champions. I thought Jon Jones handled it well, and I enjoy the mainstream explosion of MMA in Brazil, and have to credit the UFC with finally bringing the sport of Vale Tudo some legitimacy in Brazil, the country of its birth, where it's been sort of a redheaded stepchild of the sporting world in Brazil for over a century now. It's never really been accepted as anything but a spectacle, despite some people like the Gracie family becoming legitimate mainstream stars in Brazil with periods of great interest. It's always been a boom and bust thing. It's never been established as a true sport. So congrats to the UFC. I hope they continue their success in Brazil for many years to come. Now I'm going to tell you guys why you owe Jon Jones not only an apology, but $54.95 if you're a UFC fan. And that's simple. It's because even though he didn't want to cancel UFC 151, he didn't mean to cancel UFC 151, he did cancel UFC 151, and for that we thank him. That was not a pay-per-view quality card. That was not a $55 card. You had a one-fight card. You had Jon Jones against Dan Henderson. Solid headliner for any UFC pay-per-view. Not a fight of the century or anything. Dan Henderson's older and undersized, a true middleweight, 40 years old. Enormous underdog to Jon Jones. I'd still like to see him, should he be able to beat Lyoto Machida, get a shot at Jon Jones. I think he deserves it. I think he's got a fighting chance. But honestly, Jon Jones has pretty much cleaned up the light heavyweight division. If he beats Vitor Belfort this weekend, goes on to beat Dan Henderson or re-beat Lyoto Machida, the only guys in the light heavyweight division that are at all interesting for him would be up-and-comers Phil Davis and Alexander Gustafsson, both of whom's records have been smirched with losses, but I think they both could earn a title shot in the next year or two. But honestly, the fights I want to see are Jon Jones versus Anderson Silva and Jon Jones in the heavyweight division. That's what I want to see from Jon Jones. But let's talk about UFC 151 and what a POS card it really was. You had 5 fights on the main card. Jon Jones versus Dan Henderson, pay-per-view worthy, no doubt. Quality headliner, one of the best of the year in a relatively thin year. Then for the co-main, originally it was going to be Jake Ellenberger against Josh Koscheck. That would be a decent co-main event, trying to build up Ellenberger as a star and a contender, and getting by on the star power and still formidable fighting talents of Josh Koscheck. But once Koscheck pulled out, you had Jay Heron, fresh from Bellator, where he fought for the title in the welterweight division against Ben Askren and lost, and before that coming off a Strikeforce run that was completely unsuccessful, where he couldn't get a title shot against Nick Diaz despite being signed for that express purpose. And before that he was in the IFL, and before that he was in the UFC before. So this is a middle-aged guy in his mid-30s, older as a fighter, not known to the UFC audience. That fight's been moved to the UFC on FX Brown versus Bigfoot card coming up later this month. It's at least that's going to be the co-main. That's here's what I'm telling you. The only fight, all the fights on UFC 151 got moved to other cards except for Jones versus Henderson, which was canceled when Henderson tore his MCL. But Ellenberger versus Heron is the only one of those fights that's even going to be on the main card of FX and Fuel free TV events. The UFC themselves is telling you that card was not a pay-per-view caliber card. Ellenberger versus Heron going to be on the main card of UFC on FX, so it's a major cable station caliber fight at least. But then you got Dennis Seaver versus Eddie Yagan. That's going to the preliminaries of UFC on Fox, not a pay-per-view caliber fight. You've got Dennis Hallman versus Thiago Tavares going to the undercard of UFC on FX, Brown versus Bigfoot. Again, not a pay-per-view caliber fight. You've got John Leininger versus Yasuhiro Urashitani going to the UFC on Fuel undercard. Going to UFC Macau, not at all a pay-per-view caliber event. And then look at the UFC 152 card, which is dramatically beefed up by the arrival of Jon Jones versus Vitor Belfort. Otherwise, we'd be looking at a flyweight title fight as the headliner of a pay-per-view card. As much as I'm looking forward to Joseph Benavidez versus Demetrius Johnson, and I think that could be one of the best fights of the year, honestly, flyweights at this point in time are not sexy to UFC fans. It's a completely unknown division. Those guys are known as bantamweight also-rans to the fans who've been paying attention. Bantamweight is not even over as a division. Featherweight is not over as a division. Lightweight is barely over as a division, and really only when Nate Diaz or BJ Penn is fighting in it. These are not popular divisions, and flyweight is the smallest and most stinky. And Michael Bisping did not help matters by making fun of Joseph Benavidez all week in a brutal cutting contest. The third fight, which would have been the co-main event, Michael Bisping versus Brian Stann. I think there's some interest in it. I think the UFC is trying to push Brian Stann a little bit harder than fans are really interested in. Stann hits really hard. He's got a compelling story as a former combat marine in Afghanistan. But honestly, Bisping versus Stann, it's in a good place. Third on the card. It's definitely a pay-per-view caliber fight, and I think it could be a co-main event on a lot of cards. But this card is better off that it's in the third slot. However, the other two main event cards, Matt Hamill versus Roger Hollett, what the fuck? Matt Hamill's coming back from retirement. Roger Hollett just got kicked out of Bellator. This is not a major league fight. This is not a pay-per-view caliber fight. And then you got Cub Swanson versus Charles Oliveira in the featherweight division. This is a pay-per-view caliber fight. I think Oliveira is somebody who could challenge for Jose Aldo's featherweight title at some point in the future. And Cub Swanson's a proven veteran and well-known to UFC and WEC fans. It's a marginal. I think, honestly, it'd be better off on the FX card. But, I mean, the FX card's basically got very little. It's got Evan Dunham versus TJ Grant. It's got Vinny Maglies versus Igor Poktarak. And then otherwise, Jimmy Hedges, I think, against Marcus Brimage has a little potential. I think Jimmy Hedges is somebody that's shown some star potential. But again, he's a featherweight, not a huge potential star. Sean Pearson versus Lance Benoist. I don't even know how to say the guy's name, which doesn't say anything since I don't know how to say anybody's name. But the FX card is not just lined with fights ready to jump up to the pay-per-view card. The UFC's been putting on too many pay-per-views. They've been putting on too many fight cards total. They've spread their butter thin, and it's good to see them consolidate an event. I hope that they rein things back a little bit next year or have a sudden influx of talent. I mean, I'm all for more fights. I'm just for more quality fights. And since I have to pay for these fights out of pocket just like everybody else, I want to see value for my money. And thank you, John Jones, for saving me the $54.95 I would have spent on UFC 151. And we'll be back later with my UFC 152 predictions. Then I'll be back on Sunday with my UFC 152 reactions and responses. Hope everybody has a good weekend and enjoys UFC 152 on Saturday.